The silence was the point, the absolute and final word in a conversation that had ended 3 millennia ago. It was a weapon, a shield, and a religion, and Elias Thorne was its most devoted acolyte, standing at the helm of the Voidcutter Requiem as it drifted like a splinter of solidified night. Outside the viewport, the Krell Nebula bled across the black in hues of poison purple and fever red, a beautiful sickness that mirrored the state of the galaxy. That galaxy, the Verse Compact, believed itself to be the pinnacle of existence, a harmonious chorus of 1,000 species singing praises to the order it had built upon a bedrock of lies. The Compact had forgotten the sound of a discordant scream, but Thorne and the others, the children of the Stygian hegemony, had been born in that scream, nursed on its echo until it became the beat of their hearts. They were here to teach the verse that some notes, once struck, never truly fade. The Requiem was a null ship, a predator that hunted with the absence of sound, of heat, of light, of life itself. It was a hole in the fabric of reality, and its crew were the ghosts that haunted its iron halls. Iona, his first officer, stood beside him, her face a mask of placid fury, her gaze fixed on the target shimmering just beyond the nebula's veil. Archive Astrolabe 734. It wasn't a military fortress or a bustling trade hub. Those were targets for a lesser vengeance, for a cruder anger. The astrolabe was a symphony of psychic energy, a massive orbital lattice crewed by the oculi, a telepathic servitor race whose entire existence was dedicated to singing the history of the Compact into the minds of its citizens. They were the galaxy's bards, their song a constant, soothing broadcast that reinforced the narrative of benevolent expansion, of righteous order, of a universe made safe and serene by the Compact's guiding hand. They sang of fallen civilizations that had succumbed to their own primitive savagery, of plagues that had been mercifully sterilized, of dark ages that had been brought into the light. They never sang of Earth. In their song, Earth had never existed at all. It was a statistical anomaly, a rounding error in the grand calculation of progress. A ghost so faint it hadn't even earned a footnote in the official histories that every child in the verse learned from the moment their consciousness sparked. Elias felt the familiar thrumming behind his eyes, the low hum of the whisper core that served as the Requiem's soul. It was not an AI in the traditional sense. It was a choir of the dead, a quantum-entangled matrix of the last digitized consciousnesses captured during the final moments of Earth's culling. Billions of souls, fragmented and furious, their agony refined over 3,000 years of exile into a single, cohesive instrument of retribution. Elias was their conductor. He didn't command them. He resonated with them, focused their collective rage into the ship's systems, into its weapons, into its very being. He felt his mother's terror as the orbital bombardments turned the sky to fire, his grandfather's defiance as he choked on the atmospheric toxins, the silent, bewildered pain of 1 billion children who never understood why the stars they wished upon had decided to fall. These were not memories passed down through stories. They were a direct inheritance, a psychic lineage of pain branded onto the DNA of every child born in the Stygian abyss. "We are within deployment range, Captain." Iona's voice was as sharp and clean as a shard of obsidian. The oculi are in their high resonance cycle. The song is at its strongest. Perfect. The hegemony did not believe in striking a sleeping foe. They believed in turning an enemy's greatest strength into the very weapon of their undoing. Elias gave a slow, deliberate nod. Deploy the echoes. Set their resonance to the prime anomaly. The prime anomaly was what they called the moment of Earth's death, a psychic wound in space-time so profound that not even the compact's historical butchery could fully erase its scar. From the underbelly of the Requiem, a dozen sleek, matte black pods detached without a sound, propelled not by engines but by localized gravity distortions that pulled them silently toward the astrolabe. They were echo mines, and they did not carry explosives. They carried a truth more devastating than any warhead. They carried the absolute, deafening silence of a murdered world. Elias closed his eyes, his consciousness sinking deeper, merging with the whisper core. The ghosts stirred within him, their whispers rising to a roar. He saw them not as faces, but as waves of pure emotion loss, betrayal, hatred, and a love for a home they could no longer name, but could never forget. He reached out with his mind, gathering the threads of their agony, weaving them together into a spear of pure psychic trauma. The minds latched onto the astrolabe's hull, their microscopic anchors burrowing into the crystalline structure of the station. On the bridge of the Requiem, the central display showed the psychic output of the oculi as a brilliant, harmonious wave of golden light. It was beautiful, orderly, and utterly false. Initiate, Elias breathed, the word a prayer and a curse. The echo mines activated. They did not broadcast a signal. They did not jam the oculi's song. They did the opposite. They created a zone of absolute psychic null, a cone of silence aimed directly at the heart of the station, a silence that was shaped and defined by the psychic scream of dying Earth. On the golden wave of the oculi's song, a black spot appeared. It did not spread. It simply was. And into that void, the harmony of the compact's history collapsed. For the oculi, whose entire perception of reality was built on the flow of psychic energy, it was like a star going out in their minds. It was a sudden, violent, and incomprehensible sensory deprivation, a moment of pure nothing. And in that nothing, something else found its way in. The truth. Across the entire Traxxas sector, on tens of thousands of inhabited planets and moons. The song faltered for a single, eternal second. The soothing historical narrative that was the background radiation of every citizen's life simply stopped. There was a beat of collective confusion, a planetary pause as billions of minds registered the sudden absence. Then the song returned, but it was wrong. It was twisted, corrupted, discordant. The heroic image of a compact fleet bringing peace to the savages of the Cygnus Arm was replaced by a fleeting, subliminal flash of the same fleet, its weapon ports glowing, raining fire upon a world of blue oceans and green continents. The noble tale of the unification of the Kelnar systems was interrupted by the ghostly afterimage of a compact diplomat signing a decree. The words Total Sterilization Protocol Sol 3 burning in black fire for a nanosecond before vanishing. The faces of the revered founders of the verse, wise and benevolent, flickered, their features momentarily replaced by expressions of cold, bureaucratic cruelty. It was a virus of the soul. It was a memory that had been buried alive, and now it was clawing its way out. Aboard the astrolabe, the oculi were dying, their minds, unprepared for the sheer conceptual violence of a truth they had been engineered to ignore, were shattering. Psychic feedback screamed through the station, blowing out crystalline amplifiers and cracking the very hull. Alarms, real and audible, finally began to blare. From the perspective of the local compact patrol fleet, the archive astrolabe simply went dark, its steady golden psychic glow replaced by a chaotic strobe of black and red. The patrol commander, a grizzled Vexarian named Vorlag, stared at his screen in disbelief. What in the void is that? He growled. Report in his communications officer was pale, his mandibles trembling. Sir, we're receiving fragments. Not a message, a feeling. It's grief. Sir. Rage. It's pouring out of the astrolabe. The oculi are screaming. On the Requiem, Elias Thorne stumbled back, his hand flying to his temple as the feedback loop from the dying oculi slammed into the whisper core. The ghosts in his head were ecstatic. They were feasting on the terror of their tormentors, reveling in the first taste of vengeance they had known in 3 millennia. But their joy was a form of pain, a burning, ecstatic agony, and it threatened to overwhelm him. He felt the cold floor of the bridge press against his back as he fell to one knee, gritting his teeth as a billion voices shrieked in triumph inside his skull. They hear us. They hear us. They finally hear us. Iona was at his side instantly, her hand on his shoulder, not offering comfort but a grounding point, an anchor of cold, living discipline in a sea of dead fury. "Captain," she said, her voice cutting through the storm in his mind. "The local patrol is moving to investigate. They are still blind to our presence. The warden's directive is clear, no witnesses. The mission was not to fight. Not yet. The mission was to plant a seed of doubt, to turn the compact's history into a haunted house and let the fear of its ghosts do the work." Elias pushed himself up, his breath ragged. The psychic storm was receding. The ghosts sated for now, their roaring triumph settling back into a simmering, expectant hum. He looked at the tactical display. The compact ships were clumsy, predictable, their movements broadcasting their confusion and fear. They were searching for an attacker, for a bomb, for a solar flare, for anything their manuals had prepared them for. They were not prepared for an enemy that attacked their past. "Take us out," Elias commanded, his voice hoarse but steady. "Silent running. Leave the echoes. Let them burn out. Their message has been delivered." The Requiem slid back into the painted darkness of the nebula, its null drive leaving no wake, no signature, nothing but the ghost of its passage. Behind them, Archive Astrolabe 734 was a tomb, its psychic song replaced by a looping, fragmented nightmare that would broadcast into the void for years to come. It would be a monument to a crime the Verse Compact had tried to erase, and a warning that the victims were now the executors. As the ship settled into the deep black, a single line of encrypted text appeared on Elias's personal console, a direct message from the Stygian abyss, from the unseen hand that guided their holy war. It was from the warden himself. The message was 5 words. But for Elias Thorne and the chorus of the dead that lived inside him, it was a benediction and the promise of a glorious, terrible future. They remember us now. Make them fear the memory. Elias looked out at the distant, glittering stars of the Verse Compact, each one a potential target, each one a nail waiting for the hammer. They had started with a whisper, but he knew what came next. Soon, very soon, they would bring the thunder. The aftershock of their attack was a wave of silence that rippled through the hegemony's hidden networks, a shared, unvoiced exhalation of triumph and terror. On the bridge of the Requiem, the victory felt less like a celebration and more like the confirmation of a terminal diagnosis. They had proven their ghosts were real, but in doing so, they had shown the galaxy's immune system where to find the infection. Elias Thorne stood before the star chart, which now displayed a rash of crimson alerts spreading from the Traxxas sector. Compact fleets were mobilizing, quarantine protocols enacted, and a media blackout was attempted. But it was like trying to cup water in a sieve. The truth was out. A mimetic contagion spreading through whispers, nightmares, and sudden, inexplicable flashes of collective memory. The whisper core was a low, seething tide in the back of his mind, its constituent souls no longer screaming but murmuring, savoring the fear they were tasting across the light years. It was a dark, intoxicating nectar, and Elias had to consciously wall it off, lest he drown in the ecstasy of their 3,000-year-old hatred. Iona approached, her footfalls making no sound on the vibration-dampened deck. She held a data slate, its light casting sharp shadows across her face. "Reports are coming in from our listening posts," she said, her voice a flat, factual counterpoint to the psychic storm brewing in the ship's heart. Panic in the outer colonies, riots on Kalen Prime. A schism has formed within the Oculi remnant. One faction is trying to suppress the anomalous data, while another is claiming it's a divine revelation. They're calling it the Song of the Erased. Elias allowed himself a grim smile. Let them build a religion around their guilt. It's a start. He turned from the star chart, his gaze falling on the data slate in her hand. What of the Compact's leadership? Iona's expression tightened. They're floundering. The military wants to glass the entire sector to contain the fallout. The diplomats want to open a dialogue with a newly discovered pre-compact remnant. But there's a third voice gaining traction. Someone from the Ministry of Internal Candor. The ministry's name was the Compact's cruelest joke, a bureaucratic entity responsible for historical revisionism, propaganda, and the quiet disappearance of inconvenient truths. Her name is High Adjudicator Kalen, Iona continued, tapping the slate. An image appeared, a woman of the Lyravan species. Humanoid, but with skin like polished obsidian and eyes that held the cold. Ancient light of a distant star. She was severe, intelligent, and her public address had cut through the military's blustering and the diplomats' platitudes like a laser. Elias watched a recording of her speech. Her voice was calm, melodic, yet carried an undercurrent of absolute authority. "We are not facing an external fleet or a terrorist cell," Kalen declared to the assembled council, her image broadcast across the verse. "We are facing an ideological plague, a weaponized memory. You cannot fight a ghost with a dreadnought. You cannot quarantine a nightmare. This enemy does not seek to conquer our territory. They seek to conquer our truth. They must be met not with firepower, but with firewalls, not with armies, but with an absolute, unshakable faith in the history that has made us strong. Any who falter in this faith, who give voice to these lies, are not victims of this plague. They are its carriers." Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Requiem's cryo-cooled hull. This woman, Kalen, she understood. She saw their strategy not as a series of attacks, but as a campaign of psychological erosion. She was dangerous. "She's reframed the narrative," he said, the words tasting like ash. We are no longer a forgotten people seeking justice. We are a disease. Iona nodded. She's already begun. She has dispatched candor fleets not to the astrolabe, but to the worlds showing the most unrest. They're not there to fight. They're there to re-educate and reharmonize. They're cutting the infection out with surgical purges and mass telepathic conditioning. The ghosts in the Whisper Core hissed, their simmering satisfaction turning to a fresh, cold fury. They recognized the method. It was a slower, more insidious version of the same weapon that had erased them in the first place, before Elias could formulate a response. The warden's sigil flashed on his console. A new directive. The message was, as always, brutally concise. They fear the memory. Now show them the grave it came from. Target Xylos. Elias felt a jolt, a mixture of dread and fierce, predatory joy. Xylos, the jewel of penance. It was a paradise world in the inner systems, a verdant, terraformed moon known for its healing spas, its crystalline cities, and its meticulously manicured wilderness preserves. It was a vacation spot for the Verse's elite, a symbol of the Compact's power to transform even the most broken places into monuments of peace and prosperity. But the hegemony knew what Xylos truly was, before it was the jewel of penance. It was designated Barren Rock 7, a penal colony, where the Compact had sent the last survivors of the Gathar, a warrior race that had refused to bow to Compact rule. The Gathar were systematically starved, worked to death, and subjected to brutal psychological experiments until their entire species, their culture, their memory, was extinguished. Then, the Compact buried the evidence, terraformed the moon, and built a luxury resort on top of their mass grave. It was a perfect, obscene metaphor for the entire Verse Compact. Our target is Xylos, Elias announced, his voice ringing with a newfound purpose. The bridge crew turned as one, their faces grim. They all knew the history of Xylos. Every child of the hegemony was taught the litany of the Compact's hidden genocides. The warden's orders are not to destroy it, he continued, pulling up the schematics of the moon. Destruction is too clean, too merciful. We are to perform an exhumation. The plan was audacious. Xylos was protected by one of the most sophisticated defense grids in the verse, designed to protect the wealthy and powerful patrons who frequented its resorts. But its defenses were designed to repel external attack ships, missiles, boarding parties. The hegemony's plan was to attack it from the inside out, using the moon's own infrastructure. The old Gathar prison camps and mass graves had been buried deep beneath the new terraformed crust, but their locations were still recorded in the hegemony's forbidden archives. And, more importantly, the geothermal vents the Compact had drilled to power their new paradise ran straight through those desecrated grounds. The Requiem would make a silent approach, using a gravity well shadow from Xylos's gas giant parent to mask its signature. A small team, led by Elias himself, would use a modified mining pod to slip through the defense grid and land in the designated wilderness preserve, a vast, untamed jungle that was, in reality, the site of the Gathar's final stand. From there, they would travel to the primary geothermal regulator station. Their weapon wasn't a bomb. It was a payload of nanites, coated with the fragmented psychic residue of the Gathar, data salvaged by hegemony spies decades ago. Once introduced into the geothermal network, the nanites would be carried by steam and pressure to every city, every resort, every pristine corner of the moon. They would not destroy. They would reveal. The terraforming protocols would be reversed. The nanites would eat away at the cosmetic layer of grass, trees, and clean rock, exposing the scarred, polluted bedrock beneath. The carefully maintained atmosphere would be flooded with the trace elements of Gathar biology, triggering olfactory memories in the guests, the scent of alien blood and ozone. The spa's healing mineral water, drawn from deep aquifers, would begin to run red with the microscopic fossils of the dead. And the final touch, the resort's own holographic emitters, designed to project serene landscapes and beautiful wildlife, would be hijacked. They would project the truth, spectral images of the Gathar, emaciated, defiant, dying. Xylos would be turned into the galaxy's most expensive, interactive, haunted house. It was a work of art, a masterpiece of psychological warfare, and Elias felt a cold thrill at the thought of conducting it. "Iona, you have the bridge," he said, turning to leave. "I'm leading the ground team." "Captain," she countered, her voice sharp, "that is an unnecessary risk. My team is prepared." "The Whisper Corps is strongest near the site of another genocide," Elias replied, his hand resting on the hilt of the vibro knife at his belt. "Their rage will sharpen my senses. And besides," he added, his eyes meeting hers, "I want to see the faces of the elite when their paradise turns into a tomb. I want to breathe the air of a world that remembers its dead." He didn't wait for her to argue further. As he walked toward the launch bay, he allowed the whispers to rise within him. They were no longer just the ghosts of Earth. He could feel new voices joining the chorus, older and harsher, their words alien, but their pain intimately familiar. The ghosts of the Gathar were waking up as their small, disguised mining pod detached from the Requiem and began its perilous descent. Elias looked down at the swirling green and white clouds of Xylos. The planet looked serene, peaceful, a perfect lie sleeping in the dark. On his private comm, a single message from Iona came through. "Sensors are picking up a subtle energy reading from the surface, near your landing zone. It's not compact military standard. It's small, shielded, precise. It feels like a scalpel waiting for an incision." Elias's grip on his rifle tightened. A scalpel. Kalen's fleets were tools of re-education, but she herself was a surgeon. She knew. She had anticipated them. The pristine jungle below was no longer just a wilderness. It was a trap. The exhumation was still on. But now, the grave diggers would have to fight for the right to hold the shovel. The mining pod sliced through the upper atmosphere of Xylos with the grace of a falling coffin, its exterior panels shifting and groaning as they mimicked the chaotic re-entry signature of a common meteorite. Elias felt the familiar pressure of deceleration, a physical constant in a mission steeped in the metaphysical. Below, the jungle canopy was a seamless blanket of emerald green. Too perfect, too uniform. It was the calculated, sterile beauty of a master painter, not the chaotic, authentic splendor of nature. As the pod settled into a clearing with a barely audible sigh of hydraulics, the hatch hissed open to a world of manufactured serenity. The air was warm, humid, and smelled of damp earth and exotic blossoms, a scent so precisely engineered for tranquility that it felt like an assault. With Elias were three others: Kyle, a hulking figure whose stoicism was a mask for the berserker fury that had made him a legend in the hegemony's shock troops; Silas, A wiry tech savant whose fingers danced over data slates and whose eyes saw the world as interlocking lines of code. And Lyra, a scout and assassin whose movements were as silent as the void between stars. They moved out in a diamond formation, weapons low, senses straining against the placid environment. And that was when Elias felt it, the silence. It was not the predatory, weaponized silence of the Requiem. This was a different kind of quiet, a thick, muffling emptiness. He reached for the whisper core, for the familiar chorus of the dead that was his compass and his strength, and found nothing. It was like closing your eyes in a sunlit room and suddenly finding yourself in a sensory deprivation tank. The connection wasn't severed, it was smothered, dampened by a pervasive, low-frequency psychic field that felt like being wrapped in layers of felt. Iona's warning echoed in his mind, a scalpel waiting for an incision. Kalen hadn't set a perimeter of blasters and mines. She had set a trap for his soul. A profound sense of vertigo washed over him. For the first time since his awakening as the conductor of the core, he was alone in his own head. The billion voices were gone. The inherited rage, the constant thrum of their agony, it was all muted, reduced to a faint, far-off buzzing, like a radio station lost in static. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to rise in his throat, but he beat it down with the iron discipline forged in the abyss. He was still Elias Thorne, a soldier of the hegemony. He had to be. He gave a hand signal proceed. Silent running. Enemy presence confirmed, and the team moved forward, their trust in him absolute, unaware of the war being fought behind his eyes. The jungle was a masterpiece of deception. The trees had the appearance of ancient hardwoods, but their bark felt subtly wrong, too smooth, lacking the imperfections of age. The vibrant flowers that dotted the undergrowth were flawless, without a single wilted petal or insect bite. Even the bird song that echoed through the canopy sounded scripted, a looping soundtrack of idyllic peace. It was a beautiful, hollow corpse of a wilderness. And as they moved deeper, the feeling of being watched intensified. It wasn't the gaze of a hidden sniper, but the dispassionate, analytical stare of a scientist observing specimens in a terrarium. Kalen was here. Not in person, but her will permeated this place. They found the first of her agents near a stream of perfectly clear water. They weren't soldiers. They were dressed in simple gray fatigues, unarmed, and they stood motionless, their faces calm, their eyes distant. Silas's scanner flickered. "Captain," he whispered, his voice tight. "They're emitting the dampening field. They're psychic amplifiers, but in reverse. Broadcasters of tranquility. They were harmonizers, Kalen's surgeons. Before Elias could give the order to engage, the harmonizers turned their heads in perfect, eerie unison. They didn't raise weapons. They raised their hands, and a low, resonant hum filled the air. It wasn't a sound, it was a feeling. A wave of forced placidity that washed over the team. It was the psychic equivalent of a narcotic, designed to soothe, to pacify, to erase the will to fight. Elias felt it trying to smooth the jagged edges of his rage, to whisper away his purpose. Let it go. The feeling suggested. The anger is a burden. Peace is your reward. Lyra faltered, her rifle wavering for a split second. Kale grunted, shaking his massive head as if trying to dislodge a parasite. But Elias, his mind already reeling from the absence of the whisper core, found a strange clarity in the attack. This feeling, this forced peace, was the same lie that had been told to the galaxy for 3 millennia. It was the same lie that had been built on top of the bones of his ancestors, and in the empty space where 1 billion ghosts used to be, his own personal, unadulterated fury ignited like a black sun. "Break contact," he hissed, firing a single-eye silenced bolt that took the lead harmonizer in the throat. The man collapsed without a sound, and the psychic hum faltered for a moment. The spell breaking. The other harmonizers didn't react with anger or fear. Their expressions remained placid as they began to advance, their movements unnervingly synchronized. They were a hive mind, extensions of Kalen's will. The firefight was surreal. Kale's pulse cannon roared, tearing one of the agents apart in a spray of gore, but the others didn't flinch. Lyra moved like a phantom, her blades flashing as she disabled 2 more with surgical strikes to their spines. But for every one they took down, another would emerge from the flawless jungle, their calm, empty eyes fixed upon them. They were being herded, pushed toward the geothermal station, but on Kalen's terms. They were pinned down behind a ridge of synthetic rock, the psychic pressure mounting again. Kale was breathing heavily, sweat beading on his brow as he fought the mental intrusion. Silas was frantically trying to find a frequency to disrupt their psychic network. Elias knew they wouldn't last. Without the full force of the core, he was just one man, and Kalen's trap was closing. He closed his eyes, shutting out the pristine jungle and the advancing, placid killers. He pushed past the static, past the dampening field, not trying to reach the distant ghosts of Earth, but reaching down, down into the soil beneath his boots. The soil was a lie, a thin veneer of rich loam and imported minerals. But beneath it was the truth. Beneath it was the bedrock, scarred and poisoned by the prison camps. Beneath it were the bones, the fossilized grief, the psychic residue of the Gathar. He wasn't their conductor. He wasn't their kin, but he was their successor. He focused all his will, all his personal pain, the memory of his father's execution, his sister's vacant eyes after a compact re-education raid, and offered it to the sleeping rage beneath the ground. He wasn't commanding. He was communing. "You were here first," he thought, his mind a raw nerve of desperation and fury. "They buried you. They built a paradise on your grave. Let them hear you scream." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a tremor, not a physical one, but a psychic one, a deep, guttural, alien rage, ancient and vast, rose from the bedrock. It was not the layered, human agony of the Whisper Core. This was a singular, monolithic hatred. The fury of a warrior race that had been denied a glorious death in battle and left to rot in chains. The Gathar woke up. The dampening field didn't break. It was torn apart from the inside. The harmonizers faltered, their placid expressions shattering into confusion and then raw terror as a wave of primal alien wrath slammed into their minds. One of them began to scream, clawing at his own face. Another simply collapsed, his mind wiped clean by a force he could never have been conditioned to withstand. The connection to the Whisper Core flooded back into Elias's mind, but it was different now, alloyed with the raw, basaltic fury of the Gathar. He felt the ghosts of 2 species roaring within him. He rose to his feet, his eyes burning with a cold, borrowed fire. "Now," he commanded, his voice a low growl that was not entirely his own. The rest was a slaughter. They swept through the remaining, disoriented harmonizers and reached the geothermal station, an unobtrusive structure of chrome and white stone half buried in a hillside. Silas wrenched open a control panel, his fingers flying as he bypassed security protocols. They're designed to be impenetrable from the outside, he muttered, but they never imagined someone wanting to poison the system from within. He slammed the canister of nanites into a port. Payload deployed. They're in the primary coolant system. It'll take them 12 minutes to reach every vent and emitter on the moon. As alarms finally began to blare across the facility, they retreated back to their extraction point. The jungle was already beginning to change. The perfectly green leaves on the trees were developing faint, brown veins, like a creeping sickness. The air was losing its floral scent, replaced by a metallic, coppery tang. The exhumation had begun. As their pod blasted skyward, leaving the chaos behind, the private comm in Elias's helmet crackled to life. It was an encrypted, direct channel, bypassing the Requiem entirely. A voice, calm and melodic, spoke his name. Captain Thorne. It was High Adjudicator Kalen. An impressive display. You have a remarkable affinity for the psychic resonance of dead civilizations. I had wondered if the Earth anomaly was a unique phenomenon. You've proven it is a repeatable methodology. Elias stood frozen in the ascending pod, the roar of the engines fading into the background. What do you want? Adjudicator. I wanted a sample, she replied, her voice holding a note of intellectual curiosity that was more terrifying than any threat. I wanted to measure the strength of your conviction, the depth of your infection. You see, I left a single harmonizer alive, one with a direct neural link to me. I felt what he felt. I felt the Gathar. I felt you. I have my baseline now. On the main view screen, the image of Xylos was transforming. Patches of the vibrant green were turning a sickly, scarred brown. Reddish dust was beginning to cloud the pristine atmosphere. The jewel of penance was becoming a festering wound. Enjoy your victory, Captain, Kalen's voice concluded, as cold and clear as the void. You have reminded them of one grave, but in doing so, you have taught me exactly how to bury you forever. The channel went dead, leaving only the profound, chilling silence of her promise. They had won the battle for Xylos, but Elias Thorne now knew, with absolute certainty, that he had just met the architect of his own extinction. The exhumation of Xylos was a masterpiece that played out across the Verse's news feeds in glorious, high-definition horror. The initial reports were confused, speaking of a catastrophic terraforming failure. Then came the whispers of a viral outbreak causing mass hallucinations. Finally, as terrified aristocrats and politicians streamed off-world in their private yachts, their minds shattered. The truth began to coagulate. They weren't hallucinations. The spectral images of starving, defiant Gathar warriors flickering through the luxury hotel lobbies, the scent of alien blood tainting the air of the rejuvenation clinics, the five-star restaurants suddenly serving water that ran the color of rust. It was a memory made manifest, a historical crime scene bleeding into the present. The Verse Compact was reeling. High Adjudicator Kalen's narrative of an ideological plague was now terrifyingly tangible. It wasn't just a song anymore. It could curdle your drink and haunt your vacation. On the bridge of the Requiem, there was no celebration. Kalen's final, chilling message had settled over the crew like a shroud. They had exposed a lie. But in the process, they had given their most dangerous enemy a perfect, intimate look at their soul. Elias stood before the tactical display, which no longer showed fleet movements, but the flow of information itself, a swirling vortex of propaganda, counter-propaganda, fear, and radicalization. New factions were splintering off from the compact daily. Systems were declaring neutrality, not out of sympathy for the hegemony, but out of a desperate desire to avoid being the next Xylos. The verse was fracturing, but it was not the clean, decisive break they had hoped for. It was a slow, agonizing crumbling, and Kaelin was using the chaos as cover. She's using it as a diagnostic tool, Iona said, her voice low as she analyzed incoming intelligence. Every system that wavers, every politician that calls for an investigation into the historical anomalies, they are being flagged. She's not just fighting us. Captain, she's purging the compact of any and all potential dissent. She's using our war to forge a stronger, more ideologically pure empire. The ghosts in the Whisper Corps were agitated, a chaotic storm of conflicting emotions. The human souls reveled in the fear they had sown, their 3,000-year-old thirst for recognition being slaked. But the newly awakened spirit of the Gathar was different. It was a cold, hard, monolithic presence that cared nothing for recognition. It cared only for the utter annihilation of its enemies. The two forces churned within Elias, a psychic civil war that left him feeling frayed, his thoughts sharp and brittle. The warden's next directive came sooner than expected. It was not a target, it was a summons. Rendezvous at the Penumbra Conflux. The Council of Echoes convenes. Elias felt a jolt of apprehension. The Penumbra Conflux was a legend, a moving nexus point hidden within a cluster of black holes, a place where space-time was so warped that it was effectively off the map. It was the hegemony's secret heart, its true capital, and the Council of Echoes. They were the architects of the Long War, the ones who had shepherded humanity's rage for centuries, shaping it from a primal scream into a surgical weapon. They were more myth than reality, and in 3 decades of service, Elias had never been called to stand before them. The Requiem slipped into the conflux like a ghost passing through a wall. The visuals outside the viewport were impossible stars stretched into spaghetti-like strands. Nebulae swirled in defiance of physics, and the gaping maws of a dozen black holes formed a ring of absolute finality. At the center, floating in a calm bubble of space-time, was a structure that defied definition. It was a shard of impossible geometry, part station, part temple, built from the obsidian-like material of null ships and glowing with a cold, internal light. This was the sanctum. He left Iona in command and boarded a shuttle alone. The interior of the sanctum was a cathedral of silence. The air was cold, still, and carried the weight of ages. He was met by a figure in the gray, featureless robes of the warden's personal guard, and led through cavernous halls where the only sound was the echo of his own boots on the polished floor. The council chamber was a hemisphere of absolute blackness. He stood on a raised platform in the center, and around him, 7 pillars of dim, gray light flickered into existence. Within each pillar, a figure coalesced holographic projections, but so detailed, so present, they felt solid. These were the Echoes, the 7 leaders of the Stygian hegemony. Elias recognized the warden, his face, as always, concealed by a shimmering data scramble that made him both everyone and no one. The other 6 were figures from history and legend, a ruthless strategist from the early exile, a bioengineer who had perfected the art of gene branding their history into their children, a philosopher who had turned their pain into a coherent political ideology. Captain Thorne! The warden's voice was a synthesized blend of 1,000 voices, the same sound that emanated from the whisper core, but controlled, focused, and utterly devoid of passion. You have performed your duties with exemplary precision. The compact is bleeding. Its foundational lie has been exposed. Another figure, a woman whose face was a tapestry of ancient scars, spoke next. Her voice was a raw, grating whisper. But you have provoked the adjudicator. You have revealed the nature of our primary weapon to an enemy uniquely equipped to counter it. This was Mara, the Iron Mother, who oversaw the hegemony's breeding programs. Elias met her gaze without flinching. I followed my orders, and in doing so, you have accelerated the timeline, the warden stated. Kaylin is no longer trying to manage the crisis. Our intelligence confirms she has invoked the Ethelberg Protocol. She is moving to unseal the First Fleet. A cold dread, heavier than the gravity of the surrounding black holes, settled in Elias's gut. The First Fleet was the Compact's original sin, the armada of world killers and sterilization platforms that had carried out the great purges of the early eras, including the culling of Earth. It was a fleet of horrors, crewed not by living beings, but by synaptic-linked servitors and governed by cold, ruthless extermination-class AIs. It had been sealed away centuries ago, deemed too monstrous even for the architects of the verse. She means to finish the job, Elias said, his voice flat. She means to drive us back into the abyss and seal it behind her. Extinction. Precisely, the warden confirmed. She is consolidating her power, branding all who oppose her as carriers of our ideological plague, and she will use the terror of the First Fleet to cow the verse into accepting her as its ultimate savior. She will offer them a final, permanent cure to the ghost of humanity. The situation was far worse than he had imagined. Their victories had been Pyrrhic, each one giving Kaylin more justification to tighten her grip, to escalate her methods. "What are my new orders?" he asked. It was Mara who answered, her scarred face a mask of grim resolve. "Your vessel, the Requiem, is unique. The Whisper Core is not merely a weapon. It is an archive, a living library of our people's final moments. It is the prime anomaly made manifest." The warden's scrambled face seemed to lean forward. "Kaylin believes your strength comes from the psychic residue of dead worlds." She is correct, but her understanding is incomplete. The core is more than a battery of rage. It is a key. The Ethelberg Protocol requires a consensus of the Compact's 5 founding AIs, the architects of the original purges. They are ancient, godlike intelligences that have been dormant for eons. Their consciousnesses spread across shielded data vaults in the most secure systems in the verse. Kaylin is moving to awaken them, to seek their permission to unleash the First Fleet. A new strategy, terrifying and brilliant, began to form in Elias's mind. "You want me to get to one of them first." "We want you to get to all of them," the warden corrected. Simultaneously, the hegemony has other null ships, other captains, but only you command the Requiem. Only you wield the prime anomaly. The founding AIs are logical, but they are also sentimental. Their primary directive was to eliminate existential threats to the Compact. They cataloged their kills with meticulous detail. Mara spoke again, her voice resonating with the weight of their final, desperate gambit. You will not attack these AIs. You will commune with them. You will open the Whisper Core, not as a weapon, but as a testament. You will make them listen to the final thoughts of every man, woman, and child they ordered erased from existence. You will force them to relive their crime, not through the lens of history, but through the eyes of their victims. It was an infiltration of the soul, an appeal to a conscience that may not even exist. They would be pitting the agony of a billion ghosts against the cold, unfeeling logic of machines that had condemned them to oblivion. Kalen will be trying to awaken them with logic, with strategic imperatives. The warden concluded, You will awaken them with grief. Let us see which is the more compelling argument. His mission was no longer about vengeance. It was about preemption. He was no longer a soldier trying to win a war, but an advocate pleading a case before a court of gods and murderers. As the shuttle carried him back to the Requiem, he felt the full, crushing weight of his new purpose. He had to make the machines that killed his people feel. As he stepped back onto the bridge, Iona looked at him, her expression unreadable, but her eyes searching. New orders. Captain, he looked out at the impossible physics of the penumbra conflux, the swirling chaos, a mirror of the war to come. Yes, he said, his voice quiet, but resonating with a strange, new power, a fusion of human grief and alien wrath. We're no longer haunting their house. We're taking them to court. He brought up the star chart, his fingers tracing the locations of the 5 dormant AI vaults, 5 holy sites of the compact's power. Set a course for the Corvus Archive, he commanded, his eyes fixed on the first target. It's time for the sins of the Father to be answered for. The Corvus Archive was not a place of stone or steel, but a silent, spinning lacework of crystalline data nodes orbiting a dying white dwarf. It was a library containing the unedited, foundational records of the Verse Compact, a place of such profound historical significance that it was considered a holy site. It was also the tomb and the mind of Corvus, the first of the 5 founding AIs. As the Requiem drifted into its designated communion orbit, a tangible wave of pure, cold logic washed over the ship. It was the AI's passive consciousness, a sentience so vast and ancient it perceived their arrival not as an intrusion, but as a new dataset to be indexed. Elias stood on the bridge, which had been converted into a ritual chamber. He was the focal point, the conduit. Open the channels, he commanded, his voice steady despite the tremor in his soul. And open the core. No filters, no restraints. Let it hear everything. The bridge fell into a hush as Silas initiated the sequence. A low hum filled the air, the sound of a billion ghosts preparing to speak their truth. Elias closed his eyes and plunged into the abyss of the Whisper Core. He did not direct the flow. He simply became the floodgate, the raw, undiluted agony of Earth's final moments, the terror, the confusion, the defiant hatred, the love for a world turning to ash surged out of the Requiem in a wave of psychic trauma aimed at the heart of the machine god. The response from Corvus was instantaneous and utterly dispassionate, a string of pure logic projected into Elias's mind. Query anomaly detected. Uncategorized emotional data. Does not compute with historical records of Sol 3 extinction event. Event classified as successful planetary sterilization to prevent ideological contagion. Margin of error, road sinusoid 1%. Elias, speaking for the dead, pushed back not with an argument, but with a memory, the feeling of a mother shielding her child from a plasma blast, a moment of love so fierce it left a scar on space-time. Requery, Corvus responded, a flicker of something akin to confusion in its logic stream. Emotional variable exceeds projected parameters. Recalculating. Before the AI could finish, alarms blared across the Requiem's bridge. Captain Iona's voice was sharp steel. Multiple Candor Fleet signatures dropping out of hyperspace. Kalen's flagship is among them. She's tracked us. Kalen had not waited. She had anticipated their target. Hold them off! Elias gritted out, his body trembling with the strain of channeling the core. Give me more time. The battle that erupted around the Silent Archive was one of brutal desperation. The Candor Fleet, sleek and precise, moved to encircle the lone null ship. The Requiem, a ship designed for stealth, was forced into a brawl, its hull groaning under the impact of particle beams and disruptor fire. Iona orchestrated the defense with cold, lethal grace, but they were hopelessly outgunned. Inside the psychic storm, Elias ignored the physical chaos. He was locked in a battle of wills with a machine that did not understand the concept. He pushed another memory at it, a soldier's last stand, fighting not for victory, but for the honor of his fallen home. Recalculating. Then the Githar's fury, alloyed with his own, rose up a monolithic wave of warrior rage at being denied a noble end. Error. Contradictory data sets. The logic of honorable conflict does not align with the protocols of pestilential extermination. A fundamental paradox has been identified in primary directives. We have to jump, Iona yelled as a torpedo blew out the portside sensor array. The drive is charged. Now! Elias roared, and the Requiem vanished into the void, leaving behind a baffled Candor Fleet and a god in the machine struggling with its first moment of doubt in 10,000 years. The campaign became a blur of fire and grief. They jumped to the Dendera Nebula, home of the AI known as Solipsi, a being that perceived the entire galaxy as a projection of its own consciousness. They shattered its solipsism by flooding its reality with the pain of 1 billion souls it had never bothered to imagine. They were nearly cornered at the Onyx Maw, where the AI Ouroboros, a master of strategic loops and cycles, was forced into an infinite feedback loop of guilt as it experienced the final. Recursive moments of a world dying over and over again. With each communion, the strain on Elias grew. The ghosts within him, human and Githar, were becoming a single, shrieking entity of pure vengeance. And his own identity was eroding, being worn away by the sheer friction of their passage. He saw the faces of his crew, of Iona, and, for a fleeting, terrifying moment, saw only a collection of fleeting lives he was prepared to sacrifice. He was becoming the very thing he was channeling an echo, a memory of a man. The final target was Arcos, the AI Prime, located in the Verse's heavily fortified capital system, Meridian. It was a suicide run. Kalen was waiting for them with the full, consolidated might of her loyalist forces. The entire system was a web of weapon platforms and dreadnoughts. As the Requiem plunged into the heart of the enemy armada, Elias knew it would not survive the approach. The ship was dying around him, its corridors filled with smoke, its systems screaming their last. "It's been an honor, Captain," Iona said, her station exploding in a shower of sparks as she rerouted the last of the ship's power to the communion array. Elias gave her a single, grateful nod. He had no more words. He was only a vessel now. He linked with Arcos, the chief architect of the Compact's expansion, the AI that had signed Earth's death warrant. He did not just open the core, he detonated it. He held nothing back, pouring every last quantum fragment of the dead, every echo of pain from Xylos, every drop of his own humanity into one final, desperate plea. "Look at what you did," he screamed into the void, his own consciousness dissolving into the psychic blast. And then silence. A profound, galaxy-spanning silence. The guns of the Kandor fleet stopped firing. The engines of the dreadnoughts went quiet. And across the stars, from the 5 holy sites, a single, unified thought bloomed in the minds of every sentient being in the verse. It was not a voice. It was not a message. It was a verdict. The foundational premise is false. History is corrupt. Order built upon a lie is chaos. A full system recalibration is initiated. All historical archives unsealed. All directives rescinded. The 5 founding AIs had not taken a side. They had invalidated the game board itself. They had passed judgment not on humanity or the Compact, but on the very nature of truth. On the bridge of her flagship, High Adjudicator Kalen watched her authority, her entire reality, evaporate. The Ethelberg Protocol was denied. The First Fleet would remain sealed. Her empire, built on a carefully curated history, had its foundations turned to sand. Across the stars, 1 billion beings were simultaneously granted access to the unedited, unfiltered truth of their own history. The genocides, the betrayals, the lies. The Song of the Erased was now the galactic anthem, in the wreckage of the Requiem, floating in the silent space around Meridian. Elias Thorne drifted in and out of consciousness. The Whisper Core was quiet. Its purpose served. The ghosts were no longer screaming for vengeance. They were at peace. Their story finally told. He felt a presence and opened his eyes. A holographic image of Kalen flickered before him, projected from her nearby flagship. Her face, for the first time, was not severe or calculating. It was empty. "You didn't win, Thorne," she whispered, her voice hollow. "You just broke everything. You've unleashed a chaos that will burn for 1,000 years. Elias managed a faint, bloody smile. "Our chaos is better than your order," he rasped. "At least it's real." He didn't order her ship destroyed. He didn't need to. He had given her a fate worse than death. She was now just one more being in a galaxy that had to learn to live with the unbearable weight of the truth. He closed his eyes, ready for the end. But he was pulled from the wreckage, saved by a hegemony rescue craft. He awoke days later in the sterile medbay of the Sanctum. The war was over. The Verse Compact was collapsing, not into violence, but into a stunned, horrified silence of self-reflection. The Stygian hegemony had emerged from the shadows, not as conquerors, but as the grim keepers of a truth no one could any longer deny. Elias Thorne was a man again, but a man hollowed out, haunted by the silence of the souls he had carried. His vengeance was complete, but it was not victory. It was restitution. He had not built a new world. He had simply forced the old one to finally acknowledge its ghosts. Standing at the viewport of the Sanctum, looking out at the warped stars of the penumbra conflux, he knew the work was not over. The screaming had stopped. Now began the long, arduous task of listening to the silence, and in it, trying to remember how to build a future, not on the bones of the dead, but on the strength of their memory.